I'll take your questions now.
Vina Colley has had her hand up for quite a while.
Hi, I'm Vina Colley, and I'm from the Portsmouth Gas and Diffusion Plant in Piketon, Ohio. And my question to him is, why is the United States on full track of making nuclear weapons? At Piketon, we've already started up the centrifuge, and it can go up to 25%, which will make nuclear weapons. They're in full steam ahead of making small modular reactors so we can reprocess the transuranics, and then hopefully they can get all this produced up to 25%. And so it sounds to me like the United States has gone full-blown nuclear. Every site that you talk to, they're getting ready to produce nuclear weapons again at all of these sites. And at Piketon, we have the highest rate of cancer in the state of Ohio. Joe Mangano just come and did a epidemiologist study there, and we have the highest rate of cancer in the state of Ohio. Plus, we're like 85% national. Why are we producing more nuclear weapons when we've got so much that we don't know what to do with? We have no place to put it. They're storing it on sites. They're putting them in waste cells. And it's beyond me why they want to make these communities to be guinea pigs and sacrifice people living in these communities like a dumping ground for nuclear weapons.
That's an excellent question, and I direct all of your attentions to a book by Tom Mueller called Crisis of Conscience. There is one chapter in there on Hanford, which is a massive nuclear weapons complex in Washington State that will scare you to death because it purports to be, and you have whistleblowers galore from nuclear scientists to engineers from Bechtel and others. It purports to be, and probably is, a Chernobyl times 10 in the making. So your question is pertinent in so many ways. I'm not sure I can exhaust all of them. But President Obama, after promising in his nuclear posture review effort to do something about nuclear weapons that reflected what we had started to do in 1992 and 93, you'd be amazed at how many Americans I tell this to that they just simply look at me with goggle eyes. We destroyed Russian, Soviet Union at the time, and U.S. nuclear weapons to the tune of about 25,000 in each of our inventories, over 50,000 weapons. We got us down to about 5,000. We got them down to about 5,600 or so. This was a euphoric time. I remember Colin Powell waxing eloquent in his office one day, saying that Gorbachev had changed the world. The person who ended the Cold War was Mikhail Gorbachev. You know, the war had lots of aspects to it, but the person who really brought it to a closure was Gorbachev. They could have hung on for another decade or two, or even longer, possibly, if they'd changed some of their economic measures and the way they were doing things. But Gorbachev saw the idiocy, and Shevardnadze, his foreign minister, and Jim Baker, our Secretary of State, we all had these conversations. We talked. Today, there's a restriction on any American diplomat talking to any Russian. You cannot talk to them. You cannot talk to them. We're forbidden from talking to a guy who Colin Powell talked to every day virtually on his cell phone, Sergei Lavrov, probably one of the most accomplished diplomats in the world. So Obama changed the nuclear posture statement, and I think his primary reason was what you just insinuated. This nuclear weapons niche in the military-industrial complex, as Eisenhower called it, is one of the wealthiest niches in the complex. It's a very small group of people. It's a very small group of labs. It's a very small group of senators and representatives who support those labs. But they make gazillions of money off of things like tritium and warhead technology and missiles. Look at the ballistic missile we're looking at right now. That thing's going to bankrupt us. What we're doing is we're deciding, as I said before, in this bigger tapestry of our strategic approach to the world that we want to have more nukes than anybody else has nukes. And that's what we're operating on. Now, if you've listened to Ted Postal at Massachusetts Institute of Technology, emeritus professor up there, who probably knows more about these weapons than anyone in the world, you know that we've just developed fusing for our MIRV warheads that now, and this is highly technical, and I don't pretend to understand it, but after talking with Ted, I think I've got the picture. What happens with these MIRV warheads before this technology was developed is that maybe 10 warheads come out of the ballistic missile nose cone, and each of them is headed at the silo that the missile was aimed at. In this case, probably a Chinese or a Russian silo, where their ballistic missiles reside. Well, you either get fratricide on one or two, or you get some that aren't quite on target. And so you don't get assuredness of knocking out that ballistic missile, which is well underground and very, very small target. We've now invented fusing that actually tells these warheads where each other is in the shot as they're descending on the Soviet ballistic missile, and directs them within a circular area of probability, which used to be about 10 or 15 meters. I know you think a nuclear weapon, if it misses by 10 or 15 meters, it doesn't make any difference. No, it does if it's trying to take out a buried missile of your enemy. So now we have this device, fusing device, which tells all the warheads exactly where to go. No fratricide. It's a work of genius, no question, technical genius. No fratricide, and every single warhead with 500 times the power of the bombs we dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, every single warhead hits the target. So you've eliminated the enemy's most formidable way to get you back, his ballistic missiles. That's a first strike capability. And that's why we're doing it. We're developing a first strike capability. Now, I'll let you guess whether or not we'd ever have a president insane enough to do that. I think the signs of late have been dramatically affirmative in that regard. So your question is the question of the day, if you will. We are embarked on insanity with regard to nuclear weapons, and we're embarked on it because we think our technical capacity to develop these weapons even further, regardless of the trillions of dollars it's going to cost, and right now it's about 2.7 trillion just to do what they're trying to do, we think that we can hold our primacy forever if we have these weapons, even if we hold it in a nuclear winter that lasts 2 decades and prevents any farming on the face of the earth. That's how stupid this is. But your question is highly pertinent.
David DeChant.
You got that right. It's Deschamps. It's French.
Okay.
Thank you, Colonel. I have 3 questions. You kept mentioning we give up all of these treaties. Who are the we? And then how do we hold them accountable? As you say, it's up to us as citizens of a democracy to do that. And then thirdly, the question I'm posting now in the chat is an internal national security issue, which I believe to be profound, is the pandemic of veteran suicides. I think we've been betrayed since the Vietnam Holocaust, which I survived up until present day folly. The betrayal of our warriors and our lives and the sacrifices that we made. How do we engage and diminish this pandemic of veteran suicides?
Let me take your first question. It's the easiest to answer. Every president since George W. Bush who started it has had a hand in this, including Donald Trump. I have to say Joe Biden, too, because he was chairman and ranking member on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee and had everything in the world to do with Congress saying, yes, yes, yes. So those are the people, the presidents that we've had since George W. Bush and some members of Congress. Veteran suicide is another issue altogether, which I get into almost every day. We have small initiatives going down at Fort Liberty, for example, formerly Fort Bragg. where we've introduced a pickleball program that's being very successful in getting vets' attention off themselves and onto something else. We have other projects like Project Healing Waters, where we teach veterans to fly fish, things like that. These are small programs. What we have to do is stop these stupid wars. That's what we have to do. That's what's causing the post-traumatic stress. That's what's causing most of these suicides. Not all of them. You're always going to have some suicides. I felt it was really irresponsible, the Chief of Staff of the Army, some removed, who said when the suicide rate began to tick up, well, the suicide rate in the country is high, insinuating that, he had no responsibility for the suicide rate in the services because the country had a high suicide rate. Sorry, you have a little bit different responsibility, General. But we are doing everything we possibly can from the outside, I think. I know a lot of people who are working on this problem, a lot of organizations who are working on it. But as long as we persist in having these stupid wars, people used to ask me, I was the military veteran, student veteran representative on the campus of William & Mary for 16 years. A lot of veterans down there, a veteran community, very veteran-friendly community. A lot of the veterans would tell me things, and not just there, GW too, the Navy ROTC there, and Navy predominates on GW, but there were some veterans there as students. And what they'll tell you is, I didn't fight for freedom. I didn't fight for democracy. I didn't fight for any of those things that I was told I would fight for when I came in, and that I was told I was fighting for in Operation Enduring Freedom. I didn't fight for that. I fought for Halliburton. I fought for Lockheed Martin. I fought for George W. Bush and his angst about his daddy. All kinds of excuses for why they really fought. These are not stupid people, by and large. They figure it out pretty quickly. And then you come home and you say, what did I do in Afghanistan? How many children did I kill? How many women did I kill? How many villages did I march into and blow up? How many airstrikes did I call in on a village where I knew civilians were being hit? How many times did I do this, and what did I do it for? And when you answer that question, what did I do it for, and put your conscience against what you did, you wind up with a problem.
Understand, sir. My concern is, why isn't the American people outraged at this grotesque failure of the American government?
Because we have an all-volunteer force that touches none of them.
Where's the coverage like COVID-19? Where is the coverage of this pandemic?
You're asking me a question
citizens, not the veterans community like TAPS, which I'm a volunteer for, et cetera, as you mentioned. It's where's the citizens' outrage at this pandemic?
You will never have Americans interested in their military when what you have, in essence, is an all-recruited military.
Bring back the draft.
Absolutely. I belong to the All-Volunteer Force Forum. That's our number one priority, bring back conscription. We just briefed a Republican senator who told us, in essence, it's a political impossibility. We briefed a Democratic senator who told us, he happens to be chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, so you know who it is, Jack Reed of Rhode Island. He told us, with a smirk on his face, impossible.
I would bring the draft back and start at age 26.
I'd start at age 50, and congressmen had to go first.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Without hesitation. All right. Enough of my bantering, but thank you. Thank you for being there. Semper Fi, wage peace.
You have the same anger, and you have the same anger in your heart I do.
Adam Toothaker.
Hi there, Adam Toothaker from Maine. I have a question about the media. I see you on Judge Napolitano's show all the time, and it's always great. And I was wondering if you ever get a chance to go on any of the corporate cable news shows, would they have you on? Is it something that you request to go on, and how does that work? Or do they not even want to hear what you have to say?
That's a very good question, one I've pondered myself, and I think I've come up with a pretty firm answer. I don't know if you saw me when I was, but I was on MSNBC, CNN, Fox, all of them. About a year after I came out of the State Department, because I I essentially gave a speech at the New America Foundation where I told the truth. I felt like my guilt was so heavy for the Iraq War that I had to tell the truth. So I went to the New America Foundation. The director of the foundation said, "I'll bring all the press you want in." And he did. He brought them all in, New York Times, Washington Post, everybody that he could get his hands on. And I gave a speech that you can find on YouTube sometimes. And I just laid it into Dick Cheney and Donald Rumsfeld and George W. Bush and the whole gang. And everybody wanted me. Everybody. I mean, I was on every show you could imagine. Rachel Maddow to what was the one that was so popular with Chris Hayes. And then all of a sudden, I started talking about current events in that regard, like Smedley Butler did, for example. Smedley Butler, who said I was a criminal on 2 continents. That's what he said. He was a Marine general who won the Medal of Honor twice. He said I was a bigger criminal than Al Capone. He had 2 states, I had 2 continents. Marine 2-star general. He didn't have much of an audience after he made his testimony to the Congress to that effect. I didn't either after I began to criticize current events rather than past events. It was very conducive to the political atmosphere, both Democrat and Republican, for different reasons, to use the criticism. Now it's not conducive anymore. They don't like the criticism of the empire. They particularly don't like the criticism of the relationship with Israel. And they, for some reason, and frankly, I can't figure this out, the New York Times and the Washington Post in particular, are enamored, I mean, in love with Zelensky. They think Ukraine is an absolute redoubt against the evil empire of Russia, when in fact we caused the whole thing. We were responsible for the coup d'etat in 2014. We were responsible ultimately for Putin's invasion. It's incredible, and sometimes I find myself pondering how I can believe the transition from the way they treated me, for example, when I was exposing George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, and Donald Rumsfeld. And now when I'm trying to do the same thing with other characters that are beloved of them. Therefore, I am a pariah. So that's why I went to the alternative media.
Ed Flaherty.
Today or yesterday, apparently, the U.S. administration told Israel, well, you got to clean up your act or we will stop sending arms in 30 days.
Political, complete political act.
The 30
It's after,
part.
It's after November the 5th.
Yes, and so what is this? Just a matter of trying to get a few pro-Palestinian Democratic voters to think, oh, well, maybe they'll do something.
You got it.
Is there any meat to it at all?
No, I don't think so. I got fooled myself. You may have seen me on The Judge when I talked about it on Judge Napolitano's show. I thought Secretary Austin, Lloyd Austin, the Secretary of Defense, had grown a few courage cells, you might say, because he was standing on the border there with Lebanon with Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense, in front of him. And he was telling him, 21 days. We need 21 days for diplomacy to work. We don't need an invasion. We need 21 days. Then he went back to the airport and stood by his plane and said the very same thing. 21 days, diplomacy. Well, I've subsequently found out that that was in league with Netanyahu and Yoav Gallant. It was to lull the Lebanese and Hezbollah in particular into thinking no attack was coming because they attacked the next day. So that's what kind of maneuver this is.
Anna Loy?
I wanted to go back. Well, first of all, I wanted to thank you very much. This has been a very, very interesting talk and extremely depressing. But anyway, I'm really glad for the information. But I wanted to go back to the fate of Ukraine. And you said something about Zelensky perhaps approaching the point where he wanted to sue for peace. And so I'm just wondering what you thought that would look like, and what you see the fate of Ukraine is.
That's an excellent question in terms of the fate of Europe, I think, and the fate of NATO, certainly. Zelensky's hoist upon his own petard right now, and the fuse is burning very close to the explosive. He's got to remain somewhat subservient to Washington and less so to London, because they're really just our poodle now, which is a very disturbing development. Because he knows that if he cuts and runs from our embrace too fast, he'll probably be cast away or even assassinated by the CIA. I wouldn't put that past us at all. I know how many people we assassinated while I was there. So if you're Zelensky and your real forte is being a comedian, before this all started, he was a comedian who spoke fluent Russian on the stage in Moscow to rave crowds. If you're that inexperienced in the doings of state and you suddenly are immersed in those doings with the empire, and you suddenly realize that your entire life, and now your fortune, because he's become very wealthy, rests on the relationship with that state, and you can't do anything until that state approves it. And yet you're looking at your country disappearing before your eyes. Mm-hmm. And you know that if you let it go much further, you will have nothing left, because Putin is not just going to stop and say, I'll wait until you're ready for peace. He'll keep pushing. And right now he's pushing on very, very weak lines. He could probably push to Kyiv if he wanted to. I don't think he wants to. I think he wants those oblasts that he said all along that he wants. Those ones where we threatened Moscow with ballistic missile systems we were going to put in them, which is why we conducted the coup in 2014. And we want the riches in those oblasts too. There's lots of riches there, not just great land for raising crops, but also minerals that we need. Lindsey Graham let the cat out of the bag the other day when he stood up in the Congress and he said, there's all kinds of things we need there. We can't abandon Ukraine. He's right. There are all kinds of things that are there that we need. And that's part of our reason for being there. But Zelensky's got to tread very carefully. A bullet between the eyes might be his future, and he won't get to enjoy the billions that he's put together for his nest egg. And he'll wind up being a traitor rather than a hero he is right now. How do you get off the tiger once you've mounted it? That's the real problem for him. If you get off too fast, he'll eat you. If you stay on him too long, you're going to get defeated yourself. It's difficult for him, and we're making it even more difficult. To have the courage to stand up to us and ultimately to NATO, and to say, I'm going to conduct negotiations, I'm going to declare a ceasefire. My counterpart in Russia, because Putin has said he won't talk to him, but my counterpart in Russia, probably Sergei Lavrov, my counterpart says he'll honor it. We'll have a ceasefire. We're going to have negotiations. We're going to go to neutral ground. We'll have negotiations. And oh, by the way, Washington, I don't want you there. That's probably a recipe for us eliminating him. If he says, I want to have you there, Washington, at my back, then Lavrov and others are going to be very suspect of whatever's happening there. So it's a difficult situation. I think you're right. I think it's going to have to go to that sooner rather than later. And in this case, sooner rather than later means after the election. And one doesn't know what will happen if we have a razor-thin majority and violence breaks out in this country, and we really can't get to an inaugural for maybe months. That's a factor that people are just standing back and just praying doesn't come about, but it has every likelihood in the world of coming about. Right now, the polls are showing that we will have a really razor margin. If Trump wins, Zelensky's toast, I think. And I think he knows it because Trump's told him that. So he's really caught in the middle of a unsolvable problem, if you will.
Rudyard.
Thank you, sir, for the wonderful talk. I had two questions, and you sort of touched on the second one just now. The first one is the dollar is the U.S. world reserve currency. We can basically counterfeit as much of it as we want, and other countries will have to use it. But there is a move, among a large number of countries to get off the dollar. Do you see that happening, and that perhaps hitting the Achilles heel of the empire? And the second one you've already touched on, but I was wondering about your assessment of the probability of serious violent unrest after the elections.
Your first question is one that I don't feel expert enough to answer because I'm not an economist, but I feel like it as an American citizen. I can tell you some facts that really trouble me. The Congressional Budget Office put out recently a report that says our aggregate debt in a decade will be $50.2 trillion. I asked an economist who does know economics pretty well. I said, if I sold the United States tomorrow morning, everything, bridges, roads, colleges, universities, everything, every hard asset, what would it be worth? He said about 52 trillion. I said, so if we sold the country, we couldn't pay our debt. Worse than that, the CBO announced that the interest payments on the debt necessary to prevent downgrading and default, the interest payments by that time, just 10 years away, will be equal to Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and the defense budget, or well over $2.7 trillion. There are $1 trillion this year, $1 trillion. We can't do that. You simply can't do that. I think we're going to get out of this. We're going to get out of this with a transfer, if you will, a metamorphosis into something like what the Bitcoin phenomena was about. We're going to make currency as we know it in the past, not used anymore. We're going to have everything online. We're going to have transactions that take place like Amazon transaction. You don't see cash in an Amazon transaction. If you do, I don't know how you're doing it. So I think that's the obfuscation that the world, not just the United States, but the so-called Bretton Woods system people are looking at right now. And in the process, do a colossal forgiveness of debt move. Huge move. Bank of International Settlements in Switzerland released a report. Not many people saw it. Not many people read it. Very, very esoteric type of report. The unsupported debt in the world, they say, that is to say there is no hard asset whatsoever supporting the debt, is over $60 trillion. Then they put a little footnote in saying it might be as high as 100 if you take the black economy into account too, which Michiglini told us in his book, McMafia, probably generates anywhere from $5 to $10 trillion a year. This is prostitution, gambling, drugs, and increasingly the most profitable one of all is trafficking in people, especially women. A lot of that going on around Ukraine and around Eastern Europe in general. We let Montenegro into NATO. Montenegro is the stolen automobile capital of the world. You can take your car to a Montenegrin hotel, posh hotel, check it in with the valet, wake up the next morning, your Mercedes is on a boat, repainted, headed for Italy. That's the kind of country we took into NATO, for example. So I think this is the biggest immediate problem that the American society, culture, empire confronts. But I think they've got plans on ways to get out of it that aren't the plans Russia and the BRICS and others are doing to put the yuan in place, the renminbi, or some other form of currency, or indeed maybe some technical innovation like Bitcoin for them too, and to replace the dollar. That's something they are working on. There's no question about it. I think China would really like to get out of having to do trade exclusively in dollars. and they'd like to get away from the SWIFT banking system, which we use for our sanctions tools a lot. In other words, third, fourth order effects on sanctions, let's say on this particular firm in Russia, wind up punishing someone in Germany or someone in France because the linkage is through SWIFT connected. And so we found the same thing when we were trying to bring down the AQCON nuclear network. We found Germans and Japanese and others actually participating in a network to build nuclear weapons for countries like Libya and other rogue nations, we call them. But they didn't know they were participating because it was such a long linkage to the actual AQCON network. But they were actually helping build nuclear weapons for really rogue states. How do you get out of this in a flash? You have a nuclear war. You have a nuclear war, and all debt is negated.
Oh,
Very,
well,
very,
It-
very
isn't that-
dangerous thing too.
Yeah, isn't that pleasant? Now, next question from Bill Roller.
Yeah, thank you. I'm just awed by your intelligence, Colonel Wilkerson. I've heard about you in the past, but I'm just so amazed. I'm also, it's more proof that I've worked with many, many military as a psychotherapist for years. And I've always wondered why our military always seem more ethical than the senators who send them to war. And I find that just, I see it in your eyes too. So I think,
Let me just make one comment before you go further. You sound like Colin Powell.
well, that's a very good compliment coming from you because you knew him when he was a good man. Yeah, I just, well, do you have any idea of what the purpose of NATO is now? I mean, didn't that disappear with the end of the Soviet Union? I mean, why are we in NATO at all?
It did, and we're in NATO and we expanded NATO under Bill Clinton's authorities initially, in order to make money for Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, now a part of Lockheed Martin, Grumman, and other military contractors. They were finding it difficult to sell to an American military that was downsizing by 28% post-Cold War. And so they put together this commission that Bill Clinton actually blessed that was to determine whether or not NATO should remain the same or be expanded. George H.W. Bush had said it will not go 1 inch further east, not 1 inch further east. Helmut Kohl, Chancellor of Germany at the time, had bought that and was really stunned that Gorbachev was allowing Germany to reunite and stay a member of NATO. But the guarantor of that with Gorbachev was not 1 inch further east with NATO. We violated that under Bill Clinton, been violating it ever since, and it was primarily for money. It really energized defense contractors' production lines again because they were making for Poland, they were making for the Czech Republic, they were making for all these additional countries. 32 countries. Now, can you imagine that? Dean Acheson would roll it in his grave. 32 countries with Article 5 guarantee. You go out in West Texas, find that cattle rancher, and tell him that we're promising our nuclear umbrella to Montenegro. After you show him Montenegro on a map, he's going to look at you and say, what the hell are we doing that for? Good question.
I got one more question that I want to remind people of Dan Ellsberg, who was just one of our great
good friend, and a brave man.
A good friend to America.
Yes.
So I'm reading from his book on thermonuclear war, Confessions of a Thermonuclear War Planner. And he's talking about what is the diplomatic gambit of risk-taking, of brinkmanship, which was first declared by John Foster Dulles in 1956. And I'm reading from his book, the words of Dulles in an article in Life magazine in 1956. And this is about his idea of why you have to go to the brink in negotiating and with diplomats in nuclear war. He said, the ability to get to the verge of war without getting into war is a necessary art. If you cannot master it, you inevitably get into war. If you're too scared to go to the brink, you're lost. And this is in the article, says, how Dulles averted war. Well, the war I was talking about was 1956 with Russia. Is that the credo that we're following, our diplomatic strategies following now, that we have to go to the brink to get anything done?
My answer to that would be Tony Blinken doesn't know what diplomacy is, nor does Joe Biden, nor does Jake Sullivan, nor does Lloyd Austin. We do not have a diplomat in the United States bureaucracy other than perhaps Bill Burns. And after his recent interview, I'd even say Bill is lost it. He's become a member of the imperial writ, a member of the empire. It might have made some sense to Napoleon, to Frederick the Great, to Louis XIV, to Genghis Khan, to the leader of the Mughal Empire. But think about this for a moment. In 5,000 years of human history, 3,000 of which we know a great deal about now, no empire, and there were hundreds of them, no empire ever possessed the technical means to destroy itself. So if you were doing brinkmanship in one of these empires, whether it was the Mughal, the Mongol, the Ottoman, the British even, upon whom supposedly the sun never set, if you were doing negotiations, you could go to the brink and survive, especially if you had a surfeit of power like these empires did. Today, you go to the brink and over it, you are dead, as is most of the rest of the world. That's the salient difference in imperial writ today from the 5,000 years that went before. None of those empires had developed the technical means to destroy themselves. We have. When Oppenheimer, apocryphally or not, said, "I am become death, destroyer of worlds," that was a very accurate description.
Colonel Wilkerson, thank you for your words. I'm awed by your knowledge. I wish your message got to more people.
That's why we're here. So, Joe,
It's like water dripping on a granite rock, you know? You just keep dripping.
Thank you.
Joe, did you take your hand down, or did I accidentally take it down for you? Because you were next.
Well, I thought about not asking this, but I'm going to ask anyway. Colonel Larry, thank you so much for sharing your knowledge and your wisdom with us. My question is, in your estimation, if Vice President Harris wins the election, what are the chances that she will disavow Biden's policy toward Israel?
0. I know her.
I like to have at least a modicum of optimism, but I know how politics work. Boy, do I know how politics works at this level. If the American people were to give her the space, the political space to make some changes, I could see her doing it. And by that, I mean, if these polls that are now reflecting 48 to 49% of Republicans and as high as 65 and 66% of Democrats and 60% of independents are souring on Ukraine and souring even faster on our support of Israel and Gaza. And if it continues to happen that other countries in the world that Americans pay attention to, like France and Spain, disavow Israel or break off relations with them, or as they're doing now, begin to stop sending arms to them, if that picks up and gives her the political space, then she could change some things. And that's what I would hope for.
Thank you, sir.
Truly.
Susan.
Yeah, Sue Serpa from Worcester, Mass. I'm an associate member of the Smedley Butler Brigade in Boston.
Bingo.
And also a member of the JFK Peace Speech, which Colonel Wilkerson addressed on July 4th. Thank you very much. I wanted to go back to what you said, that we, as American voters, American citizens, are at least partly responsible for the mess we're in right now. I kind of beg to differ because, as we all know, Smedley Butler said war is a racket. And we're kind of, because it's escalated, it's become more and more and more of a racket, more and more ludicrous, lucrative, that is. And ludicrous, but lucrative, that we're slaves to the system. Political power is money. We don't have the money as the voters. The money is gained from corporations that profit from war. And my question is, where do we go? What can we do? The election system is terrible with we're locked in these two warmongering parties, locked into that system. No independent or third party has a chance because they can't get the money to get their message out. I'm at a loss. I'd like to send the JFK peace speech to every elected official in this country and say, adhere to this, please. Please, these should be your roots. But they're not going to follow it. They're going to follow the money.
In that regard,
what do we do?
In that regard, I think you put your finger on one of the biggest problems we have in the political system, and that's the Citizens United decision that the Supreme Court handed down, which was the worst decision since Dred Scott, in my view. And there are a number of movements in the country right now. I belong to one of them, which started in Maine. It's called America's Promise. And we are with about 30 states, I think now, lined up. Their legislatures have actually passed motions in the legislature of those states that say they're with us for a constitutional amendment that we've written, and it will nullify the Supreme Court decision. I think that gets all the dark money, all the billionaire money, all the money that's polluting our political system, and Maine can tell you all about that. They had an election not too long ago where they saw more money come into the state of Maine from outside and even from foreign sources than Maine generated itself. It was so much money, it was overwhelming to Mainers. And Mainers don't like to be overwhelmed by that kind of stuff. So they kind of started this movement. And I think we are going to, within the next 7 years, we are going to force the Congress, because of these state constitutional efforts, to entertain an amendment to the Constitution, and we got it written. So that's one thing people can do. There are other movements like this out there too. We hope that as we get closer and closer to getting the number of states we need, they gel, and we put all that together. Our model to do this is the women's movement that brought women the right to vote.
Love it. Thank you.
Anon.
My name is Omar. I'm active duty at Fort Bragg. How you doing, sir? I just have a pretty simple question. Where do you see life for soldiers headed in the next 5 to 10 years? I'm asking that because as lower enlisted and even a lot of upper enlisted, we essentially do what we're told. And there's a lack of knowledge among me, my friends, and pretty much everybody. There's not a lot of briefing that goes on until something actually happens. And I've always thought that we'd be informed very thoroughly and consistently on like ongoing international conflicts and where it might lead us. So I just want to pick your brain about where do you see life for just the average soldier, no matter the branch, Marines, either. Where do you see it going for the next 5 to 10 years?
Well, that's an excellent question. My son's in the Air Force, so I get that question a lot. My grandson just graduated from Air Force Flight School. I was out in out in San Antonio at his graduation. And I came in as an enlisted man, and I spent some time as an enlisted man. What I told my son, first of all, and I'm not trying to scare you with this, but what I told my son was don't count on military retirement. He's really counting on that because he's got almost 20 years now. He's probably going to go for 28, but I said, don't count on getting military retirement. And let me tell you how serious it is. I'm 80, and if I live like my dad did to be 91 or 92, I think I'm going to lose my military retirement. Not only that, I think I'm going to lose Social Security too.
Mhm.
It'll be much more dramatic for me than it will be for you. But if you don't plan for this, then it's going to be dramatic for you too. So that's the parlous state, the desperate state I think the lifer military is in for. I don't know what that means. I don't know whether it means we're going to fall apart in the military or we're going to be the ultimate saviors of the country. I could see both scenarios developing. At the same time, I tell people like yourself, I used to invite enlisted personnel from the Tidewater region into my seminars. And you'd be surprised. I mean, it was amazing. I still get contact with them. They email me. I got an intelligence guy at Langley Air Force Base who's still emailing me almost every 6 months or every 3 months or so, because I just let them sit in and listen to what was happening to the empire, what I was teaching my students at William and Mary, and what I was showing them from my experience and such. And in most cases, they asked every bit as good. I had an E7, I had an E6 that were just as good as any of my students in terms of asking questions. Once they'd gotten into the material, read some of the books and read some of the articles and understood what was happening to the country. So my advice would be get as literate as you can on your own in what's happening and ask your officers about it. Don't be afraid to ask them about it. Don't hurt yourself, don't get in a
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
yeah. And the other thing we're looking at the All Volunteer Force Forum, a lot of Christian nationalism in the military now. I don't know if you've encountered it.
Yes,
But,
yes.
yeah, but there is a real problem with it, and we found out that it's actually all the way up to the 3- and 4-star level.
Mhm.
We're really worried about that. Proselytization's taking place. The Air Force Academy has a real problem with it. The Jewish students out there are constantly calling us and telling us they're being told to go to Christian breakfasts and Christmas and Christian suppers, and that
Yes.
they
Yeah.
ought to change their religion, and so forth. So I don't envy your position, but make yourself as smart as you can and keep yourself on the alert all the time and make allies and friends and do the best you can to get through it and make your decision when you get to a point where you either have to re-up or whatever as to what you're going to do from there on. I say this sometimes to audiences. I say, I would not recommend to my children that they go into the military. Then I have to say, I have a son in the military. My daughter was a lieutenant in the Army. So,
Yeah.
it's just, I can't, in good faith, turn to a student who has other prospects and say, yes, when they ask me, should I go in the military? Where are you thinking about going? Well, I'm thinking about going to the Marines or the Air Force or whatever. Well, let me tell you about it. And usually I give them a picture of, balance. And at the end of it, I think I'm the soldier in me is sad to say I've talked a lot of students out of going into the military and going somewhere else instead. But I feel like I've done them a service because I don't think the military is what it used to be in terms of being the advantage and the training ground and the educational ground that it used to be, especially for members of society who didn't have the advantages that other people did. First thing I would do, if I were king for a day, the first thing I would do, I intimated this earlier in an answer, is I'd reverse the old ancient Greek saying that old men send young men to die. I'd have young men rule and send old men to die.
Yes.
Very good. So
Thank
it
you.
looks like Donald Pagler,
Yeah, it's Pogler.
Pogler. Looks like you've got the last question, Donald.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm a survivor of the Israeli attack on the USS Liberty during the Six-Day War in 1967. I have often said that if our political clout, being a Liberty survivor, if our political clout were dynamite, we couldn't blow over a thimble. I do what I can. I give presentations about the attack, about us. But I don't have a lot of influence. I try to make people aware of it. I have met with Congress. Congress people will not deal with it. And so I would just like to thank you for where you are, taking a stand and doing what you do. And I submit that if the United States would have dealt with the Liberty, this whole thing started even way back then. So
I
thank you
agree
so
with you.
much.
I agree with you. I think that was a travesty. The investigation was a travesty. Can you give me your email address? I've just been made privy to a Norwegian document that explains a lot about what happened in terms that you can understand quite readily, with both the Russians, the Soviets, the United States, and other people who were involved in the circumstances, and most revealingly about Israel and why Israel did what it did.
I would like to, I tried to put it in the chat, but I'm not sure whether I was successful because I've got glaucoma. My sight isn't that good. So
Okay.
my email is my name, DONPAGELER @earthlink.net.
DONPAGLER?
No, PAGELER
PAGELER
at
at
earthlink.net.
earthlink.net. I
And
will
if
send
you
it to you.
and if you go into YouTube and in the search put in my name, only put Donald, not Don. Put Donald.
Okay.
You'll see a lot of the presentations I've given.
Excellent. Excellent.
Okay. Yeah, the gist of this evidence, and it's pretty damning, is they did it on purpose and they tried to kill everybody.
Yeah, yeah. Well, that's what all of us on the ship feel. Boy, I tell you, it was, and we were basically a non-combatant ship. All we had was 450 caliber machine guns. You can't bring down a jet going 600 miles an hour with a 50 caliber machine gun. So we were basically defenseless. And we had, three of my shipmates who testified at the court of inquiry 6 days later when we got to Malta, who Lloyd Painter, Lieutenant Painter, said that he went topside. He was in charge of my repair party. He went topside, opened a hatch, and saw the Israeli torpedo boats machine gun holes in our life raft. That was he testified to that at the court of inquiry. It never showed up in the court of inquiry documents. Ensign Lucas, Dave Lucas, said he scraped up gel off the deck and put it in a jar, and he turned it into the court of inquiry. It was napalm because they dropped after the fighters. They dropped napalm on us, and there was no mention of napalm in the court of inquiry papers. And Lieutenant Commander Dave Lewis, who was my boss in charge of all of us intelligence guys, he said that Admiral Geis, who was the second ranking admiral right underneath Fleet Admiral Martin, when Captain Tully of the Saratoga put up his 16 planes to come to our aid, he said that Secretary of Defense McNamara came on and said, recall the planes. And he told Dave, he said, only thing I could think of is maybe they thought there were nuclear weapons on this plane. So he said, I told both carriers to bring up older planes from below that can only carry conventional armament. He said 90 minutes after the attack started, put up a set of planes from both carriers, radioed Washington again. McNamara came on and said, recall the planes again. And he told Dave, he said, I still couldn't believe they were going to abandon us. So he decided to push it and ask him to authenticate his message. Well, you know what that means. And he said the next thing he knew, President Johnson came on and said, recall the goddamn planes. I don't care who dies. I'm not going to embarrass my allies.
Moments of perfidy and treachery like that permeate the empire
Yeah, I know.
from the very beginning, but they permeate it almost exclusively since 9/11. I got stories for you that are pretty much just like that. They're horrible stories about betrayal. Don't get me started.
Yeah.
It-
Well, if unfortunately, maybe if they'd have dealt with what happened to us, what happened to the Marines in Lebanon wouldn't have happened. So I don't know.
Maybe so. And maybe if we dealt with Kennedy's assassination, we'd have
Yeah.
a lot fewer problems too. But we
Yeah.
just swept. Every time I see Arlen Specter, all I could think about is that son of a bitch questioning people at the 9/11 or the Warren Commission and essentially directing their answers into the portfolio that would be for permanent retention that were lies. I mean, he orchestrated the lies of the Warren Commission.
Little I can by giving my presentations.
Thanks,
Good for
Don.
you. Good for you.
Well, we
There's a place in heaven for you. There's a place in hell for LBJ and the rest of them.
Yeah.
exactly. So, and there's a place in heaven for you, Colonel Wilkerson. That's a fact. So,
You don't know my crimes. I'll be in purgatory for 1,000 years.
well, this has been fabulous, and I'll ask Colonel Wilkerson just one thing. I saw you on Friday morning at the International Peace Coalition, in which you said Israel may not survive, something to that effect. So
It won't survive as a Jewish state. It can't. It's impossible. The world will condemn it just as it did South Africa. Because if it's a Jewish state, it's an apartheid state. Were it to change to a real practicing liberal democracy and allow all people that want in to come in and treat all those people roughly equal, no one does a perfect job of that, certainly not us. But if it were a functioning liberal democracy, it could survive. As a Jewish state, it's dead.
okay, there it is. All right, everybody. Colonel Wilkerson, thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank all the Veterans for Peace for what you do.